welcome everybody to Lean Product Meetup. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dan Olson. I'm the founder of a group. I actually started this, it's coming up on almost 10 years ago. I'm excited to give a talk today on how to improve your influence with Myers-Briggs personality theory. Before I do, I want to start out with some product management knowledge that some of you may know. Some of you may know it, some of you may not, but it also ties in with, why is it important to use Myers-Briggs and tools like this? And that's basically the product manager's motto. Now, the product manager's motto, it's a bit like Spider-Man's motto. With great power comes great responsibility. That's Spider-Man's motto. Exactly right. Cool. Now, yeah, exactly. Todd knows it already. He's heard it. Product manager's motto is similar. It's just a little different. And it's with great responsibility comes no power, right? And so usually people are allowed. I just gave this at a talk of the big group of people. Everyone's laughing. And, we're laughing on the outside, but we're crying a little bit on the inside, right? It's like, why does it have to be that way? People skill. And that's why the whole point of this talk is kind of like people skills is one way to describe it. And they're really critical for PMs. And it ties into the motto, right? We have to work with different functions. We are the hub. We have to work with engineering and design and marketing and data science and a lot of other teams, sales, right? But at the end of the day, nobody reports to us. And so therefore, you can't just boss someone around and tell them what to do. We have to do what's called influencing without authority, right? We have to kind of nudge, persuade, get people to kind of row in the right direction, kind of get aligned on things. It can feel like herding cats at sometimes, right? So it's really important for us to be able to do that. And, you also, you need to build strong working relationships because we work with people in so many different groups and functions, right? And so when we take a step back and think about product management skills, you can kind of divide them into hard skills and soft skills. Hard skills are things like, can you write good user stories? Do you know how to create a good roadmap? Are you good at story pointing or facilitating story pointing, right? Do you know how to conduct, market research, to competitive analysis, UX design, right? Those are kind of more hard skills. Soft skills are more like people skills, communication skills, influencing skills, things like that. And I would argue as you move up in your career, obviously you have to, when you're a PM, you have to know how to do the hard skills. You have to know how to do the work of a PM and the tasks. But I would argue that as you move up in your career, people skills are important at any level, but they become more and more important as you move up. As you become more of a senior PM, group PM, director, VP, right? More and more of your job is influencing other people. Again, even as a VP of product, the other stakeholders in the company, VP of sales, VP of engineering, they don't report to you, right? So I was excited. I want to share with you my story. So I was working as a relatively new PM, and I got put on this new project that was pretty stressful. Like we had a pretty hardcore deadline. Before that, we were working on a mature product. Everybody kind of knew the drill. We were improving the product, systematically. Everything was fine, and we worked hard. And it was somewhat stressful. But this whole new thing was kind of like a startup within this company that was very stressful. And so we created a new work team. I got to pick a couple of PMs on my team, and then I had to work with another partner, someone who actually was in our group, but I just never worked with them on something before. And a few other people that kind of were in my group, but we had never actually worked together on a project. And as we worked on the stressful project, it became clear that we were not as effective as we had been in our previous work groups and our previous work, right? And tensions were high because it was stressful, and obviously there was some frustration going on. And leadership said, hey, you know what? Why don't you all take a Myers-Briggs test? So, and it was, there were some other things that we did too, but mainly we took that test. And for me, it was like this huge light bulb going off of wow, this explains why these types of interactions are frustrating for me. And, and why I can understand why those types of interactions will be frustrating for that person. Right. So, my background is engineering. So for me, it had a lot of explanatory power for something that I couldn't explain before, which is why do things handled a certain way work well with these people, and things handled a different way don't work well with these people, and so on, right? So that's the bottom line. Is I've seen it, I saw it work effectively, empirically in that project, and ever since then I kind of made it a point to learn more about it. I also did a leadership development program into it where we also did it and learned more about it. That's really where I kind of got more formally trained in it. And I think it's a very powerful tool. So what I'd love to do is explain it. So hopefully you can have the same kind of benefits in your product career that I have too. So I want to make sure everyone's taken the test already. Here's an example of what the output, this is from the older test. This is not the one that I sent to you all, but I just want to show it. This is from this human metric. So it tells me my type, ESTJ, and then it gives you percentages like 78, 1, 28, 50, right? And so those percentages give you a sense of how strong, or is it a marginal preference or a strong preference or a moderate preference, basically, right? It's interesting because one of the things I'm going to talk about is sometimes these labels are confusing, right? There's like, sensing and, perceiving. So it's funny, they chose to use different terms for a few of these, right? So instead of intuitive, normally the opposite of intuitive is sensing, but they decided to change it to the word observant. So when you see observant, just think sensing. Likewise, on the judging, the JP dimension, judging or perceiving, they chose to change perceiving to prospecting, right? Myers-Briggs is just one of many personality tests that are out there. And so this particular company decided to change those particular words. And there's a lot of fun things out there, like showing you, hey, what are all the 16 types for if you're a Star Wars fan, right? You can kind of go in and say, oh, I'm more of a Yoda or I'm more of a, Han Solo or whatever. Just kind of a fun little thing. They have it for Star Trek or Game of Thrones. They have it for all the different things that you want. So let me get into it and explain it a bit, right? So it didn't just come out of nowhere. It actually was founded and based on the work of Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung, right? He's a very famous, accomplished psychiatrist. And so he started a lot of this kind of cognitive science work. And then Myers-Briggs kind of built on that and created what's called the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. So if you see MBTI, that's the acronym for the full thing, Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. And the idea is there's 4 preference dimensions. I'll explain them in a sec. And there's 2 choices. There's 2 ends of the spectrum for each preference dimension. So that results in 16 combinations that they call personality types, right? Now, I mentioned that for me, it's worked wonders for me in my career and been super, super helpful. All I care about is, does it empirically help me do my job better? And there's no doubt that it's done that. But like a lot of smart people out there, you want to be aware of, hey, are there criticisms? Do people believe this or not? Like anything, you can go on the internet. There are people that'll be completely panning it and making fun of it, saying it's not valid. So there is some criticism. But the reality is the main criticism, I think there's more value in there than some of the criticism kind of indicates. And the main criticism is that, it calls people types instead of traits. And it's kind of silly. It's like, okay, saying you're this type versus you have this trait. Like that's the main kind of beef that people have with it. Now, if you talk to science and say, okay, science, what's your best personality theory that you've got, right? You may have heard of this. It's called the Big Five, or it's called Ocean, or it's called Canoe. And these are basically, there's been all kinds of research done out there. And these 5 personality traits are the ones that have been validated scientifically, right? So it's Ocean, because that's the acronym for the 5. Openness, O, conscientiousness, C, extroversion, E, agreeableness, A, neuroticism, N. Now, if you look at it, like extroversion, that's exactly the same as Myers-Briggs, right? So when you see these articles criticized saying, oh, it's not based on science, it's like, what are you talking about? It's exactly the same. And if you dive into it, there's a lot of overlap between science and these Myers-Briggs dimensions. Like conscientiousness is very, very correlated with the J, judging dimension, right? Some of these are different, like neuroticism, agreeableness. Those are kind of different additional dimensions. And these aren't the only 5. If you go into psychological research, it'll kind of validate some of the other things too. So anyway, just want to kind of, for anyone who's like, well, I read online that it's complete baloney. It's not complete baloney. I can tell you it's worked for me, and hopefully it will work for you. And if you want to learn more about things, you can go learn about Ocean and read up on other things, right? So here we go. So the 4 dimensions of Myers-Briggs cover these 4 aspects, like how we interact with the world and where we direct our energy, the kind of information that we naturally notice, whether we prefer to live in a more structured way or a more spontaneous way, and how we make decisions, right? So it's all these kind of cognitive things that obviously, these are all important in not only, in your job as a product manager, how you interact with the world, the kind of information you notice. Are you more structured or more spontaneous? How you make decisions? Those are important. And if different people have different preferences on this dimension, then by understanding those differences is going to make you more effective. That's the idea. And by the way, I'm kind of focusing this on your work life, but it also can apply obviously in your personal life. Before we dive in, I want to give some caveats, having worked with this for a while. This is not like trying to say, this is who you are, no matter what, always black and white in a box. That's not what it is. What it really is it indicates what's easiest for you, right? It's not always going to predict how you're going to act. Humans are way too complicated, right? And there's more than 16 types of human personalities out there, right? But it's just like, what's easiest for you? What is your default? Like, what's going to be the easiest thing for you, especially if you're stressed or something or tired. The defaults may show out more, right? It indicates your preferences. It doesn't indicate your skill or ability. It's not like it's better to be this or it's better to be that. There's no judgment on which of these is better. Then, one analogy that helps a lot of people, it's kind of like being right or left-handed. Say you're left-handed. You prefer using your left hand. It's easier for you to use your left hand. It doesn't mean you can't use your right hand. And in fact, it doesn't mean you can't like learn to use your right hand really well because you injured your left hand or something, right? Or you built up those muscles. So it's kind of like that kind of muscle preference thing. I learned this the hard way because when I first learned, I want to tell you a story, second story. When I first learned about Myers-Briggs, I geeked out and I read all about it. I was so excited. I was like, okay, cool. I think I can like get to the point where I can kind of predict after I work with people for a while, I think I can kind of predict who they are. So I was at this leadership offsite and there was a woman that I worked with quite a bit before the offsite, and we were doing Myers-Briggs together. And I remember her name was Kathy. And in working with Kathy, she was always very supportive, very almost like maternal. Like she was older, but she was always like very friendly, very thoughtful, very considerate, And as I was learning about Myers-Briggs, I'm like, wow, that sounds like a feeler. That's like a feeler, like F. So I was like, when we got to that point, I'm like, hey, Kathy, let me guess, you're a feeler, right? And she looked at me and like her face was like clearly disappointed. So I clearly guessed wrong. Young Dan, who was super excited about applying his new knowledge. And she said, no, actually, I'm a T. And then I thought about it. So her job, she had like a PhD in statistics, and she was like this, just total numbers expert and analytical expert. And it made me go, huh, okay. So it's really like, she clearly is a T. She told me she's a T, but she clearly has built up that other muscle. Her T is her preferred hand, but she's clearly got a very strong F muscle that she can bring to bear, right? And that's what I kind of experienced more of the F muscle that I saw. So again, that just reminds you, it's not, it's kind of like people can build up that other muscle. Doesn't define who you are. The other thing is these dimensions are continuous. It's not like discrete. It's not like your E or I. It's like a percentage, and it's really like a lot of things in life. It's a bell curve, right? There are far fewer people at the extremes than there are in the middle. It's like a bell curve. And so one way to think about it is you can kind of have a scale from 1 to 100%, from E to I. Now, sometimes it's a little confusing when you look at the numbers because it'll say like you're 75% I or 75% E, right? You could also be like, well, that's 25%. So you just got to be mindful of like, where's the middle point and where are they saying that you're at? Let's go through the actual dimensions. Okay, here we go. The first dimension, Sean says those are easier to judge. Yeah, well, I think E and I is definitely easier to judge. N and S can be hard sometimes, I think. J and P, I think, is pretty easy to judge. And T and P, now that I've gotten a little better, I think it's easier to judge, but you can be wrong. You can be wrong, right? For sure. Okay. Let's go through these. Extroversion, introversion, E versus I. Intuition versus sensing. So intuition, even though it starts with an I, they use N because I is for introversion. So they use the second letter, intuition, right? Thinking versus feeling, T and F, and judging versus perceiving, right? And one thing I'm just going to jump to this other side actually is these labels. A lot of people read a lot into these labels. You have to really understand anything in life. The labels can be misleading, right? Extrovert doesn't mean, it means they're super talkative and loud. Introvert doesn't mean you're shy or inhibited. A lot of people, think, oh yeah, I'm really an intuitive. I'm very intuitive. I'm a very intuitive person. Like that's not really what it means. It's not intuition. Feeling doesn't mean you get emotional. Judging doesn't mean you're judgmental. A lot of people are like, oh, I don't want to be judging. I don't want to be considered as judgmental. Or again, perceiving. Yeah, I'm very perceptive. I must be a perceiving because I'm very perceptive. Like, so you can't use the layman, kind of the common interpretations that'll kind of send you down the wrong path a lot of times. So it's best to understand what they mean. And I'm going to explain in detail what each one means. So the test basically tells you your preference, right? Again, if it comes out 79% or 81%, that's basically just, hey, you have a strong preference, right? If it's, within 10, 15% of the middle point, you might call that a moderate preference, right? And you're within like 5%, either side of the middle point, it's probably like slight or no preference. If you take this test, different versions of the test, you'll get slightly different versions, over time. You might change over time, but also just there's noise in measurement, right? So that's really the big takeaway is less the numbers and more like, hey, do I have a strong preference for E or I, a moderate preference, or slight or no preference? That's the idea. So let's jump in then and go and define these. So extroversion versus introversion. The best explanation I've heard of this is how do you use your energy and how do you recharge your energy? So literally think of a battery. Think of a battery. You're like kind of an emotional battery, right? What gives you emotional energy and what drains emotional energy? That's kind of the way I think about it. Okay, what I want to do real quick is launch a poll. So let me create a scenario, okay? And then you can answer both of these together. Scenario one, I want you to imagine your significant other, your partner, got a new job, and you're going to the first work party with them, and they're expected to bring their significant other. It's a big party with lots of people. You don't know any of the other people because your partner just started, right, the job. And 5 minutes in the party, your partner's boss says, "Oh, I really got to talk to them." They pull them aside and say, "We have to have a quick meeting about this important thing at work." And so you end up having to like sit there without your partner at this party where you don't know anybody, and it ends up taking like an hour. And so you've got to sit there mingling and chatting with these people you don't know for over an hour. How would you feel after the party? So that's the second part of the question. So the first question is I versus E, and the second part of the question is how would you feel? And there's four combinations. I would feel exhausted and I'm an introvert. I would feel exhausted and I'm an extrovert. I'll feel energized, I'm an introvert, energized, and I'm an extrovert, just so we can kind of see. So this group, we have about 50-50, like slightly 56% extrovert, right, versus introvert. Cool. And then after the party, twice as many of the introverts said I'd be exhausted versus I'd be energized from the party with the strangers, right? And twice as many extroverts said they'd feel energized versus exhausted, right? So, and I know I told the story a certain way, and maybe but in general, that's the idea, right? If we go into E's versus I's, thanks everybody for sharing. That's kind of the thing that if we look at what does this really mean, extroverts are more focused on the outer world of actions, objects, and people. Introverts tend to be easier for them to focus on the inner world of ideas and concepts. And so if we talk about some traits, some attributes, again, they focus more outward versus introverts focusing more inward. A lot of times, this is some what people say is extroverts, if you're a big extrovert, sometimes you can speak before you think, right? Sometimes you may be like people say, like, oh, you don't have a filter because you're just saying what comes to mind. Whereas introverts may think without speaking. That means like they think a lot and they're very mindful of what they say. So at work, you may be like, there may be people that like rarely speak up in meetings, but when they do, everybody kind of listens to what they said because it's very thoughtful. That kind of person would kind of, probably be an introvert, for example. Extroversion, they're more relaxed and confident. Introversion, reserved. These are kind of generalizations, obviously. They don't apply in all cases. Extroversion scans the environment for stimulation, probing versus introverts probing inwardly. Extroverts tend to seek variety in action. Introversions usually need to get some quiet and alone time to recharge their battery. So that's a general stereotype is, hey, if an extrovert was forced to like go to a party with a lot of strangers, they would in general often maybe feel more energized afterwards. And it would fill their battery, whereas in general for introverts, it might drain their battery, right? Now, I will also say, they're introverts. If they're with a small group of good friends, you might not even know they're introverts because they're more comfortable, they're very talkative, energetic, and they could get energy from that. But like, another example might be I just came from a big conference, at the end of the day of like being at this conference with all these people, an extrovert might be more energized. An introvert might be like, I just need to go back and just like chill out for a little while to recharge my battery. The other thing I want to talk about is stressors. So, so if you're working with these other people, what can cause them stress or make them feel frustrated, right? So for extroverts, working alone can feel stressful. For introverts, having to work with a lot of other people can be stressful. Communication preferences, right? You may notice that some people like to do things via email or chat or phone, and other people like to basically do it more asynchronous, like, on Slack or, or text message or things like that. So that can be a difference between that too. If extroverts have to work for a long time without breaks, if that could be stressful. If introverts have to interact with other people frequently, right? Having to stop and reflect before they take action can be stressful for extroverts. Introverts having to react quickly if they don't have time to reflect. If you put an introvert on the spot and say, oh, you got to make a decision right away, and they feel forced, like they haven't had time to think about it, that can create stress, right? Having to focus in depth versus having too many demands. So it's a generalization. of E's versus I's? Okay. That's a good question. I kind of took some of these from different sources. Let's go back here. Why is observed and questioning, relaxing, confident? So I think what this means is, I think what it means is an extrovert may kind of reach a conclusion and feel confident in it more quickly, whereas an introvert may think about it more and question it, not like question in a challenging way, but question in their head, think about it more. I think that's the intent of what that is trying to say. I think that's what it is. Before they come to a conclusion, there's probably a better way to say it. So what I want you to do, this is an interesting thing too. I'm going to put the extroverts in one room and introverts in the other. Whether you're extrovert or introvert, think about your opposite colleagues, right? If you're extroverts, think about people you've worked with that you feel like have been introverts, or introverts, extroverts. And, write down, hey, what do you see the other type's strengths? Like, what's good about being the opposite type? And what do you see as some opportunities to be better? Does that make sense? The extroverts are still talking. Big surprise. It's an interesting observation. The introverts came back quicker. And when I came into the extrovert group, they hadn't started the actual exercise yet, even though I went there afterwards, right? So they chatted a little bit. It's all good. Cool. So I'll start with the extroverts. What were some pros of introverts that you guys came up, that your team of your group of extroverts came up with?
They work efficiently alone and they don't go off half-cocked.
Okay, there you go. Any other ones from the team?
We didn't come up with much.
That's fine. Okay, cool. And then what about opportunities for improvement for introverts, or things that you would require, wish or desire to be differently? Sometimes, perhaps.
So sometimes a 70% answer quickly is what's required. And it's very hard for introverts sometimes to give kind of directional guidance or imprecise guidance.
Yes, I see. Yes. I've seen that. It reminds me of the saying, say what you mean and mean what you say. Some people take that to heart, where they don't want to say it unless they've really had a chance to think about it and they really mean it, right? And they want to be very thoughtful about what they say. Yeah. Okay, cool.
And one thing I really like that Sean brought up is, let's say that you're in a room with your team. The extroverts are going to blurt out answers. They're going to jive off each other, but sometimes extroverts aren't going to say anything. I really like that Sean suggested in these situations, maybe write down your answers. So extroverts don't take control of the conversation, but you're including everyone.
Yes, I was going to share a couple of tips. Yeah, that's a good tip. How do you handle this dynamic that happens? Great. Let's go to the introvert group. What pros or strengths did you come up with for extroverts from the introvert group?
So I think one of the things that kind of came up was the extroverts usually are able to strike up a conversation, kind of break the ice a lot faster. That was one of the big pros.
That's a good one.
The other pro is they tend to be the super connectors, to be able to connect different groups and function together.
Yeah, I heard your group mention that. It's good. Yeah, the connections with other parts of the org or other people. That's great. Yeah. Cool. And then how about opportunities or things you wish were better or different?
And one of the things that and I think it was Sean that mentioned it, was just the 70%, answer for the top is good, but one of the things that kind of helps, at least from an introvert standpoint, is are you riffing and kind of thinking out loud, or is this kind of the decision that we're going with? Because sometimes it's hard to tell from the noise of, are you processing it externally and going through this, or did you just make a decision or have a direction and then you've moved on to the next subject or trying to implement it?
Right. I heard your team talk about that. And I think that would be, for example, in the context of a meeting, and you're trying to figure out what to do as a team, and the extroverts are kind of throwing out ideas, and it's not clear. Are we just throwing these out for consideration? Or are we actually trying to make a decision on the fly here? How much contemplation has happened versus just it's more on the fly kind of? Yeah. Makes a lot of sense. Good. Okay. Well, thanks for doing that exercise with me. Yeah. A couple of things I wanted to mention. I remember there was someone I worked with who was super smart, no doubt how smart they were, super smart. And I remember that they got put on the spot in a meeting. Like, one of the bosses said there was a change in plans or something. And somebody said, so what do you think we should do? And they kind of like froze up a little bit like a deer in headlights. And I remember noticing that and going, wow, that's, because I like as an extroverted thinker, I would not have a problem just, spouting off on the fly what I thought. And I thought that was interesting. And then I noticed that they did is they said, well, why don't we give you, an hour to go back to your office and think about it. And she came back an hour later and had a wonderful, recommendation of what we should do. So it just made me realize not everybody's great on the spot, sometimes, especially the more critical or important the decision, it's probably worth letting there be some space and for contemplation and time for contemplation. It also reminds me as PMs, a lot of times, if you're an extroverted PM, you might love to be like, hey, let's get together with a designer and have a jam session on the whiteboard. Well, if your designer's an extrovert too, that might be fun for them and they might like that. But if they're an introvert, like the person I was talking about, they may not want to operate in that dynamic. They might want to be more like, well, why don't we talk about what the goals are and then give me time to go back and think about it. And the last thing I would say is what people said in meetings, like meeting dynamics. If you have a strong E's and strong I's in a meeting, if you notice who's doing most of the talking, it's often the E's because they're very comfortable with speaking up. And what can happen is their ideas can dominate or they be the only ones that are mentioned. And so what you can do if it's your meeting or if you notice this happening is pay attention to who hasn't spoken yet. And before you reach a consensus or decision on what you're doing, say, hey, I noticed, George, you haven't said anything yet. What are your thoughts on the 3 proposals we're thinking about, right? So call out the I's to get their opinions. And then the other tip that people mentioned, which is great, is, in the very beginning, have a little quiet time, everybody write down their ideas on sticky notes. And that way everybody's idea gets a voice and it's not dominated by the loud voices that come later. So those are all good tips to kind of manage when you've got a mixed group of I's and E's to make sure you're getting the best out of the whole team, right? All right, cool. So next up is S versus N. So this particular group, 90% of people are N's. Wow. All right. So there's definitely a skew here. Maybe there's some selection bias because of the meetup or something. I'm not sure what's going on, but that's interesting to see. I'm a slight S myself, so I would tip the numbers a little bit. I'm going to show you an object in a sec, and I want to think about how you would describe that object. Here you go. Okay, here's the object. I just put a photo of the object there, and I want you to think in your mind. What are all the words? And you can write it down on a scratch pad or somewhere if you want, 4 or 5 words. Or 3 to 6 words, whatever, that come to mind to describe this object. We have a small number of S's. For the other S in the house, if you want to say or chat the descriptors, what are the descriptors? And so I'll share mine, right? If I go back to this thing, it's basically like bottle, red, glass, Coke. Those are kind of my terms, right? Okay, now let's hear from the N's. Okay, the N's in the house. What were the words that came to mind for you?
I had Coke, soda, bottle, label, and cap.
Okay. So that sounds a little more S-ish, but that's cool. So let's see. Look at Kenton, unhealthy, right? And acidic and sweet and thirsty and cold and summer and fun, right? Right. Bubbly, relaxing, old-fashioned. Yeah, I specifically picked an old-fashioned kind of Coke bottle to see. Yeah. So anyway, that's what happens is when you look at a Coke bottle, the S's are very literal. Someone even said music. They're really literal, it's a bottle, it's glass, it's red, it's got a cap, those kind of things. They're very literal about it, whereas the N's are more like, hey, it's sweet, it's unhealthy, it's cold, it's thirsty, it's relaxing, it's summer, right? Those kind of things, right? That's the idea. So what's going on with this dimension? So this has to do with, what data and how you perceive, what data you perceive and how you perceive it, right? S is, the more of an S you are, the more you perceive immediate reality and direct experience, like sensing. You can think of your 5 senses, like you see it, right? You touch it, you hear it, those kind of things. Whereas in intuition, N, is you perceive inferred meanings and relationships. So that's why you think of summer and refreshing and fun and old fashioned and things like that. So if we go through these to describe them a bit more, sensing, perceive with the 5 senses. Intuition perceives with memory and association. S's are more reliant on data and experience. Intuitions are good at seeing patterns and meanings. S's tend to be more practical. N's tend to be more innovative. Sensing tend to be more in touch with reality. Intuition is usually better at projecting future possibilities. This is, live life it is, change, rearrange life. Preference for using learned skills that they already have. Intuition, a preference for adding new skills. Sensing, basically paying attention to data, to the details, kind of like attention to details. Intuition is the big picture, right? And I kind of created a framework to explain this a little bit, how I think about it. You often hear the expression, the forest versus the trees, right? You've got your forest and your trees. Like forest is the big picture. You're looking at the whole forest, and trees, you zoom in some. Well, let's zoom in even more to an individual tree, and you can zoom in even more to an individual branch or leaf, right? There's these different zoom levels, if you will, from big picture down to details, right? And so that, in my mind, that's how I think about S versus N. The N's tend to gravitate more towards the top, big picture perspectives, and are more comfortable. It's not can you do it or not do it. It's like what's easiest and easiest for you and you're more likely to do. And the S's are more like branch or leaf. Now, to tie it more to product management too, you could also think about that as being more strategic. The bigger the picture, the more strategic it is, kind of bigger picture long term, whereas tactics is more tactical down at this level. And obviously both are important. You need strategy and tactics. And, after I learned about Myers-Briggs, I realized that this dimension, I noticed within my teams of product managers that many of the best product managers were able to span a wide part of this dimensions. And I call that dynamic range, right? There are some people that are mainly strategic. They're mainly comfortable up there. They're mainly like, hey, what's the big picture plan? What's a 30,000 foot view? And those people are very, very valuable. So you understand what's the big picture, what's the overall mission or goal we're trying to accomplish. There are other people that are mainly tactical. They are important and valuable because they get the job done. They're in there, in the trenches, working with the developers, writing out the user stories, working on the mockups, whatever it is. They're very tactical, right? And some people are comfortable. And so what I found is many of the most successful product people I know had what I call the high dynamic range, where they could span a lot of this. So they would be comfortable working on the details, but they would also be comfortable having higher level discussions of why are we doing this? What's the plan? What's the overall goal here? And then tying it down to the details, right? Sometimes if you're only working on the details, you don't understand how it connects to strategy. Sometimes if you only work on strategy, you don't have any tactics to back up and actually achieve your strategy, right? So anyway, this is something that at the end of the day, I would interview PMs on to try to assess where they're most comfortable and how far can they span, because I think that again, especially as you move up in your career, this becomes really important. So what are some stressors for, what kind of frustration causes frustration? For sensing types, if other people are just sharing their insights or ideas without any kind of practical data, that can be frustrating. For intuitive types, if they're out there dreaming big ideas, it can be challenging or frustrating for them to attend to realities. Aylin, yes, you have a question. Sorry. Do you want to unmute and ask it?
Thank you. I was gonna ask that if do we have the same range, like same steps in introvert versus extrovert? Because for myself, I sometimes feel like I'm mostly introvert, but I have enjoyed the extrovert stuff as well. And my type actually like ranging with I and E. So that's curious.
I mean, for I and E, to go back to that one, it can be context dependent, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're in a situation, like maybe you've worked at a company for a while and you feel more comfortable, and therefore you're going to be more extroverted, or you're with people that you're going to see more extroverted. Whereas if you're in situations that are new or different with people you don't know, you might be more introvert, right? I mean, again, people are complex, so this is not what you always are. It's like what's easiest for you, and it's definitely situation dependent. It's obviously dependent on your mood, your energy level, your sleep level, stress level, all that kind of stuff, right? So so it varies, right? And all these, like I said, it's kind of like a scale or a bell curve. For this particular scale bell curve, I'm trying to provide some meaning about strategy and tactics and kind of what I've observed within product managers, that if they're able to connect the big picture with the tactical details, that can be a very powerful skill set that they have. So great question. Yeah. All these, and again, if you take the test at different points in time, you might get different answers, right? Sensing types, if they have to, if they're used to doing things a certain way, if they do it a new way, that can be stressful. If intuitive types are forced to just kind of follow procedure, that can be stressful for them. Sensing types, sometimes if they have to, it's like, if say their boss is an N, it's like, hey, can you just give me a summary of it? So, I don't want all the details, just give me the summary. That can be challenging and frustrating for them because they want to share all the detail because they see all the detail and they consider that important. Likewise, intuitive types, they may, if they're being asked for more details, that might be frustrating for them too. If sensing types, are asked to kind of figure out what's the meaning or big picture of the facts, that can be frustrating. And same thing for intuitives, if they have to check accuracy of facts. When sensing types have to leave the real world and focus more on possibilities, that can be frustrating for them. And for intuitive types, if it's like, yeah, but how are we actually going to do that? You start asking practical questions, that can be frustrating for them. All right, let me stop there and see what, if any, questions we have on SN.
I just like having, but I'm reiterating the chats from like Sean and Shaitan was the dynamic range for this one, because I've seen myself in work situations kind of jumping between those two. Well, sometimes it's the practical stuff is stressing me out and I'm an N, which makes sense, but at the same time I also jump into the practical side of, well, this is how you need to be done. So the high dynamic range is helpful. Yeah. And obviously different situations call for, it also, can you adapt, right? If you're nearing launch and it's just a matter of like, what bugs are open, where are we at on these? We need to just like drive it to the end. Then maybe it's more technical. If it's the beginning of the product cycle and you need to figure out what your goals are and things like that, maybe it's more strategic, right? So yeah. Cool. Any other questions? Okay, let's move on to JP. So imagine the scenario. You're going to go on a long international trip to several countries, okay? And there's two different scenarios. Which one sounds better? Scenario one, before the trip, you plan out a detailed travel itinerary. You book all your flights in advance. You make sure you reserve a place to stay in each city. And you figure out in advance the top things you'd like to do to see in each city. And you buy tickets for that in advance. So it's like all locked down beforehand. Scenario two, you leave your travel plans more open. You definitely booked the first flight, but then you're like, you know what? We'll play things by ear from there. We'll see how we feel. We'll decide exactly what we're going to do and see after we get there. And, we'll figure out the best place to stay once we get to each city. Okay, so I'm going to launch the poll. And so again, the first question will be, are you a J or a P? And the second question is, which scenario you would prefer, one or two? So again, not surprising, we have about a 50-50 split between J's and P's, slightly more J's, 56%. And then we ask, which travel scenario would you prefer? So the general idea is the J's like to plan things out. And so J's would pick scenario one more than two. And so as I looked at the percentages, scenario one is 50% more J's pick scenario one over scenario two. The P's are evenly split between one and two. The idea is, maybe I made it a little too excessive, but in general, P's like to keep things open and not lock everything down in advance. And maybe because it's an international trip to multiple countries, people didn't want to leave things too much to chance. But that's the general idea. So thanks for doing the poll with me. And then let's talk about J versus P. So this has to do with orientation to your environment. J's typically value structure, controlling events. They tend to be more systematic and they tend to be planners. P's value spontaneity. They're curious. A lot of times they await events and they adapt to what happens, basically, right? That's the general idea, is like planning versus more adaptive and spontaneous. That's the idea. So we go through here. J's tend to focus on completing a task, right? If you are the kind of person that likes to make checklists, and then when you finish something, check it off, and every time you make a check mark, it makes your brain happy. That's like a J thing, whereas P's, they like to start things. So like to start a new thing. It's very exciting to start something new, and they may not finish, as many things as they start, right? J's, they value deciding and planning. Perceiving values taking in new information, right? So there's always new information that could be coming in to change the situation. That's kind of how they think about it. Judging, they like organizing and scheduling things. And perceiving likes adapting and changing to things. Judging can be more controlling and regulating. Perceiving can be more curious and interested. Judging can be more goal-oriented. Perceiving can be more open-minded. Judging, often J's value closure, even when we don't have complete data. And P's will resist closure to get more data, right?
So hopefully this kind of resonates with people. One thing specifically, I remember I led a prioritization exercise, and we had like 10 features, and I asked everybody to prioritize them. And everybody had finished the prioritization except for one person. And they were like literally agonizing over rank ordering these 10 features. And afterwards, I was talking to them about it, and they said, yeah, I'm a really strong P. This is really tough for me because it's really hard for me to finalize this prioritization of what we can do, as an example, right? Now, one of the things that's really important in product development, product management, is sometimes you need to apply divergent thinking where you brainstorm and create a lot of options, right? And sometimes you need to say, okay, we brainstorm a bunch of options. Now we got to figure out which ones we're actually going to do. Let's call some of these out. Let's prioritize, right? P's tend to be really good at creating options and brainstorming. And J's tend to be good at like, okay, now it's time to process these and prioritize these and schedule these, right? That tends to be. So again, it's valuable to have both on your team, right? If your team was all P's, you'd come up with a lot of great ideas, but maybe no one would actually, execute well on all of them. If you had a bunch of J's, you might prematurely say, let's do this, right? I've seen people they want to make a decision. They value making a decision so much that, as it said, before we have new data or before we've had a chance to explore or research stuff, they want to just lock it down and move on. So again, there's pros and cons, and having a mix on your team is beneficial. So what are some stressors for these types? For judging types, uncertainty is a stressor, right? They like to have things defined and understood. Kind of on the contrary, perceiving types, it's a stressor for them to have everything locked down. If they have no flexibility, they can feel kind of constrained. For judging types, it can be a stressor if there's like a lack of structure or process or it's unclear. And for perceiving types, if you ask them for a concrete, specific plan, that can be stressful for them. Judging types, if the deadlines change or you introduce changes at the last minute or late in the game, that can be stressful to them. Deadlines can be stressful for perceiving types because they don't like to have deadlines, basically, right? Judging types do not like to wait until the last minute to make a decision or take action. And then perceiving types, if there's a judger trying to get things locked down and they're like, hey, everything's going to work out. Why are you being so, worried about that stuff? Why are you being so, so that can be something that happens. Dealing with surprises and being required to commit. Once the decision's been made, if they're being asked to consider new options, that can be stressful. It can be really hard for perceiving types to rule out options. Like, why do we need to rule out this option at this point, right? All right, let me stop there and see if we have any questions there. Okay, then we'll do our last poll here. We'll do T versus F. And again, this is a two-parter. So the first question will be, are you T or an F? And then there's an exercise, okay? Okay, so we got like a 60-40 split of feelers. So it skews a little more towards feeling. Okay, now what I want to do is we're going to do this group exercise. Ready? So let me tell you the scenario, and then we're going to go into our groups of T and F. Okay, so here's the scenario. You work at a company in a very competitive industry, and they have introduced a new technology to improve productivity and to pursue a new market opportunity. And unfortunately, we have budget cuts, and you have two managers on your team, and you need to let one of them go. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you about the two managers, and then we're going to get in our groups with our Fs and our Ts, and we're going to have to decide which one we're going to let go. Okay, manager one, their salary is $150K. They've been a loyal employee of the company for 15 years. This gentleman's wife unfortunately died at a young age, so he's raising 3 young children by himself. He's historically been average to slightly above average performer. In the last year, we had this new technology. He hasn't really adjusted to the new technology, and it requires him, and he's been underperforming. He and one of his children have medical issues that require them to be late to work often. Okay, that's manager one. Manager two, their salary is $95,000. It's a relatively new hire, but has been greatly exceeding expectations so far. Has a strong resume with proven skills and experience in the new technology. Is young, single, rents an apartment, has a lot of savings in his bank account. Which manager would you let go, one or two? So I'm going to open up the breakout rooms. There's thinking and feeling. So the thinking people. So again, if you can't see it, go to the menu bar, more breakout rooms, and join the thinking or feeling room. And then talk among your group and see if you can reach a consensus on who you think of the two. We have to unfortunately let someone go. Who would we let go? So we have this tough scenario. There's no easy answer here. And let's start out with the thinking team. So you have to fire one of these people. Which one did your team decide to fire and why?
Number one, because number two is likely to provide better performance.
Okay. Got it. And what were some things that made you feel like they're likely to provide better performance?
No distractions and
Right.
demonstrated competence with the technology that's the
Right.
differentiator.
Yeah. I heard your team in the discussion. Somebody said, well, what's going on with the company? How competitive is it? And so then I reminded people it's a very competitive industry. And they're like, well, are we going after a new market with new technology? Like, yep, new technology, new market. And so that kind of like they said, okay, given all that, we're going to make the business decision to keep two and fire one. Okay, great. The feeling group, when I left, it was like a 50-50 split. Does someone, it's like 50, I think there were 50% of people said fire one and 50% said fire two. Okay, so someone who from the feeling group that was going to let go of manager one, could you share the rationale why?
Yeah, I
For that
can say
subgroup?
maybe. I thought firing manager two is unfair because she works harder than the other
Mhm.
manager. So
Great.
for not being unfair, it's reasonable to fire manager one, but it's kind of a hard decision.
Yes.
We talked a lot about this. So, but I think
Alan,
it's
that's a great articulation of the rationale. Great. I love that. We'll talk about that more in a sec. Cool. Okay. How about the other subset, the other half of the feeling group that said, you know what, we're going to let manager two go. Can you share your rationale for that? Someone from that subgroup.
Yeah, so if we ethically speak, then it's like the manager one that should be retained, and manager two can stay with the company for some time and may switch to another company. So yeah, but manager one being loyal. So I feel I
Oh,
personally
so being that because they were a loyal employer for 15 years, that's the big thing.
yeah.
Anyone else from that subgroup is that the main logic of everybody, or there's some other
One
point?
thing that we also said that he had a lot of tribal knowledge as well, so it might just help with the transition to the new technology eventually.
Okay, got it. Got it. Okay, cool. So again, there's no right answer, and it's interesting, right? So let's dive into T versus F and what might lead someone to lean one way or the other on this tough scenario. So T thinking, it has to do with how you make judgment and make decisions, right? T's tend to value the reliability of logical order, right? And like kind of like logic. It tends to be more about logic and things like that. And the feeling tends to be more about based on personal importance and values. Right now, the interesting thing I loved is that people were saying, is it fair? Is it unfair? Which one is it fair to do? Which was unfair? And everyone's striving for fairness. The real question is, how are you deciding what's fair or not? Right. So it's super interesting. So let's jump through this. So thinking tends to be decision based on the logic of the situation. Feeling tends to be decisions based on the impact on people of the decision. Thinking often uses cause and effect reasoning. Feeling is often guided by personal values. Thinking strives for an objective standard of truth. Feeling people often strive for harmony and positive interaction. Thinking people can appear tough-minded. Feeling people may appear tender-hearted. Like I know in the thinking group, when they're like, I guess we're going to be the not so popular people that let go the person with the 3 kids. Fair, right? They both want fair. Thinking wants everyone to be treated equally, and fair wants people treated as an individual, like represented what they did, right? So it's super interesting that, the thinking people thinking from the business standpoint, what's best for the business and fair to the business is, hey, this person's been overperforming. They know the new tech, maybe even they make less money. So they cost the business less if you look at that. And then the feeling, we said, hey, it's unfair. It's unfair because it's unfair to let them go because even though the other person worked there 15 years, this person's been overperforming. So that wouldn't be fair. So again, people are using fairness. And then the other group is saying, well, it's not fair because they've been loyal to us for 15 years. So that's why we want to be fair to them. So it's interesting, what's considered fair can vary, obviously. Some stressors for thinking types, relying more on personal experience versus objective criteria to assess the situation. For stressors, trying to analyze situations objectively without thinking about the people that are involved, right? Appreciating what is positive sometimes, A lot of times thinking types can like be really good at criticizing and, you know, finding holes in things. It can be tough for feeling people to bring up constructive criticism or identify flaws. It can be tough for thinking types to focus on people. It can be tough for feeling types to like focus on tasks and not people. It can be tough for thinking types to use empathy and personal values to make decisions. And it can be tough when feelers are expected to make, you know, decisions with logic alone. For thinking types, a lot of times they like to ask questions, and if sometimes people react to that and saying, "Hey, why are you asking these divisive questions?" That can be stressful for them. And same thing over here. If you ask questions that are, you know, being considered divisive, it can be tough, right? Adjusting to individual differences, like they've kind of like, hey, there should be an objective standard for everybody, and here's like applying an objective criteria and standards to everybody without considering the individuals of those people. Okay, let me stop there and see if we have any questions.
So I just had one question, like,
Sure.
does this mean the members in the feelers group, they were actually thinking rather than feeling?
No, I mean, it's, you know, we're all thinking, right? We all have our brains. That's why, again, if you look into these, if you take these two literally, it can be, right? So what I would say is, I think both groups, all three groups, were trying to be fair, and what they considered the primary criteria for being fair varied, right? We saw one group said what's fair is whoever performs the best and it makes the most sense for the future of our business, that's fair. So they picked the newer employee that was outperforming and better at the new technology. For somebody that felt like it should strictly be based on performance, therefore the one who's outperforming, it was a feeler group that said it's based on performance, how they're doing. It's not fair. If we let go of the person who's doing better at their job than the one who's not, that's not fair.
Yeah.
And then finally it was like, well, we can't, it would be unfair to let someone who's been so loyal to us go, right? So they're all, the criteria used was fairness. It's just what was the specific rationale used so yeah. So in a sense, it's obviously we're all thinking. The question is, are you thinking more about facts and objective things? Or are you thinking more about how it impacts the people and what would be fair?
And I guess the next question I have is, as a team lead, right? If you manage different folks on your team and then everybody have different types, how do you harmonize the team to achieve some consensus? What's some of the tactics? I was hoping you can get to this.
Yeah, that's great, John. It's a great question. And basically a couple things. One is, and what you find if you like, when you do a group, like when we did our exercise, we found that there were a lot of TJs in our group. And so what does that mean? That means that our company culture, our business unit culture really valued TJs. And TJs would be more likely to hire other TJs. That's kind of, you know, you can also reflect on that a little bit too. Like, where's the center of gravity within our org, right? And you start to realize, hey, this is like our org's really an F org, or our org's really more of a P org. You can start to see, you know, not everybody, but you see if you plot it out, you can see. The second thing is, you don't really want everybody to be the same type, because then you're going to kind of have groupthink and you're going to lack innovation, right? Really. So, you know, part of it is like, to go back to this divergent convergent, I don't know if you want harmony. It's not like there's going to be a lack of harmony. What I want to do is I want to use everyone's skills to get the best outcomes and the best ideas. So for example, the divergent convergent thinking, I would make sure that I've got some of my P's and N's in the brainstorming and not all my SJs in the brainstorming, so that they're just kind of, you know, that we get some creative ideas out there. Right. So it's like using the strengths of the people that are going to do. And then I would make sure that we have those people partner with the J's and the S's when it comes time to actually come up with tactical plans about okay, let's prioritize. That's great that we came up with ideas, right? So in general, the P's are going to come up with the more creative ideas, not always. And in fact, if you have J's and P's in brainstorming, they can riff off each other. And, you know, P bringing up some crazy idea can make a J think about something else that's adjacent to them, right? So that's it too, right? That's it. And then on the IE front, we talked about tactics, how to make sure that not all the airtime of who's talking comes from the E's, and that the I's idea gets heard as well, whether it's writing ideas down ahead of time, or using you know tools for people to put their ideas in ahead of time, having agendas in advance, you know, noticing who's not speaking up in a meeting, those kind of things, right? So I think it's less about harmony and more about if you have self-awareness, you can start to have self-awareness of this too. Like I recently went on a work team and I'm self-aware that I'm the J and I'm the S, and that's the value that I bring to that team. When it comes time to prioritize stuff and make plans, that's when I can, step up and shine and help the team really like turn what we want to do into tactical plans, right? But I know that when we're brainstorming high level ideas, and I want to have some of the other people, that's some of their skills and tactics is brainstorming those more creative ideas that I wouldn't have thought of if they hadn't kind of brainstormed together with me, right? So that's how I think about it, is you want to be mindful of it. Also, the other thing is, if you do the analysis of a group and you realize there's a minority, it's like 1 or 2 people that are Fs and everyone else is Ts, or 1 or 2 people that are S's, or something like that. Just being mindful of that and checking in with them, and making sure everyone's kind of aware of that dynamic that's going on, because it can be very lonely if you're the only one, or there's only 1 or 2 of you in the work group that have a strong preference. It can feel like you're swimming upstream sometimes, where everyone's on the same page and going in a certain direction, right? So I found that if you do it as a group and everybody knows everybody's type, then it can facilitate those conversations.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Other questions people have?
So I follow Hacker News. I've been surprised at the amount of just how negatively viewed Myers-Briggs is, because my experience matches yours.
Yes.
Which I found it extremely helpful for,
right.
I don't know,
right.
40 years, right?
Sure. I mean, look, here's the thing is, your mileage may vary. All I know is we had a difficult work situation. We all took the test. We all learned it, and it helped us work better. And I've used it ever since then to like help manage situations. Like also, like if something comes up in some work situation, there's some frustration or annoyance. Oftentimes you can be like, oh, that's because I'm a J and they're a P. And I'm trying to like lock things down and they're trying to like brainstorm ideas. And once you realize that, then it helps you identify it and talk to the person and say, hey, Sean, I realize, while we're trying to work on this project together, it sounds like you really want to, maybe you're a P, or I know you're a P because we did it, and you're trying to brainstorm ideas and I'm trying to bring a J it just helps have a conversation about it. It just helps take it out of your head, and it's not personal. It takes it out of being personal, or like, you're just like, I don't know why this is annoying to me. I don't understand why this is frustrating. And it gives you a vocabulary to talk about why this is frustrating, right? And okay, it could be either an EI thing. Hey, we work together a lot. I noticed in most of the meetings, you tend to do most of the talking and you don't really ask for my opinions, or, you don't solicit my opinions. That would be a great EI conversation to have. And if I was an E, I'd want to know that. Yeah, I wouldn't want to dominate the airtime. I'd want to hear what my I friends have to say, right? So I hear you. I think, my general thing, Sean, is, again, I mean, on the internet, you can find people crashing anything, right? On the internet, you can find people saying bad things about anything. So, and that's why I at least try to point out, hey, there's the big 5 ocean. If, I'm sure there are people that have criticisms of that too. But if you want to be like purely scientific, there are some personality things out there that you can go off of. Again, extroversion, introversion is completely consistent, as is conscientiousness and judging. And so, I've kind of read up a lot on this stuff. For me, again, it's just, does it work? Does it help you? Does it provide predictive power? Or does it help you be more effective? And for me, like you, the answers have been yes. So it's helpful. So I don't really worry about what someone on Hacker News has to say about it. They're probably not a PhD in psychiatry themselves, right? So again, you can find people. So, it's like any other tool. It can be helpful. It can be misused. You can misunderstand it. You could try to apply it in the wrong situation or in the wrong way. But I found it very helpful. Thanks, everybody. I hope it was helpful. Again, the book, there's that Type at Work book that a lot of people got. If you want to read up on it, Type at Work is a good book. There's also a book called, I think it's called Gifts Differing by Myers-Briggs themselves. It's like the children of Myers-Briggs are keep going on. And if you want, and again, Myers-Briggs is one of multiple personality tests that you can do. And each one, probably has some value that can help you. There's DISC, there's other ones. I haven't really studied those a whole lot. And then the other thing is, if you want to go deep, there's actually a step 2 Myers-Briggs, where for each of the dimensions, there's like 5 sub-dimensions. So I haven't had a chance to check that out, but I look forward to doing that at some point. So there's books out there you can check out if you want to learn more about it. So thanks everyone again for a great session and being engaged and the great questions. I appreciate it.